that progressives have changed over the last 30 years to sort of just get so deep into victim ideology and this idea that you can divide the world into victims and oppressors, and that to victims everything should be given and nothing required. We basically have stopped enforcing laws against open drug use, public camping, public defecation. We have open drug scenes, which we euphemistically refer to as homeless encampments. All carrots, no stick. No consequences for illegal behavior and self-destructive behavior. Three things: shelter first, treatment first, housing earned, enforcing the laws, and universal psychiatric care. We should have compassion. We should have freedom, but neither of them are worth anything and are actually quite destructive if not balanced by responsibility. I am the author of San Francisco, Why Progressives Ruin Cities, which is a book about the crime, drug, and homelessness crisis facing progressive West Coast cities, but even in other cities beyond. I am a longtime investigative journalist, author. I've been focused on the environment for 20 years, but did work on drug policy in the late 1990s for George Soros's foundation and others. Longtime advocate of decriminalization, harm reduction, but when we saw overdose deaths get so terrible around 2017, I decided to do more research on this issue, and that resulted in San Francisco, which came out last year.
So in the book, you talked about how progressive policies ruin cities, but you actually, in the past, you actually advocated for some of the progressive policies. So what made you switch or change?
Well, when I stopped doing this work in the late 1990s, it was my understanding that we were trying to move towards a model of rehab rather than punishment. So the goal would be for addicts to get the rehabilitation they need to achieve what we call recovery, which is achieving an independent life, not a life of permanent chemical dependency or addiction. And that's not what happened. We put in place a bunch of laws and also other things, changes to the judges, non-enforcement of certain laws that basically have removed responsibility from people suffering addiction and mental illness. It's not what Europe does, as I point out. Europe actually requires people to take responsibility for their health and for their role as citizens. Instead of doing that, progressives, really the radical left, has pushed to reduce or eliminate individual responsibility out of the idea that people living on the street are victims, and that victims only things should be given and nothing required. So I'm a Gen Xer, and so I see maybe my politics, my liberal politics are stuck in the 90s. My heroes were people like Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King and Gandhi. These were people who took responsibility. They had a heroic view of championing the underclass, but with a goal of greater progress and upward mobility, not a vision of what's been happening in progressive cities. And so for me, I think it's been to some extent, I'm sure I've changed, but I also think that progressives have changed over the last 30 years to sort of just get so deep into victim ideology and this idea that you can divide the world into victims and oppressors, and that to victims everything should be given and nothing required.
Could you just give the top 3 reasons, in your opinion, for why California is facing a crisis of homelessness right now?
Sure. Well, I mean, California's cities, California's governor have repeatedly invited to California people that are street addicts, the untreated mentally ill, both directly in just statements and speeches, but also through policies. We make it very attractive to come here. We basically have stopped enforcing laws against open drug use, public camping, public defecation, at least in particular downtown neighborhoods, mostly Black and brown neighborhoods in Los Angeles and Sacramento, but it's really spread across the state. We have open drug scenes, which we euphemistically refer to as homeless encampments, which are places where people gather to buy, sell, and use very hard drugs. This is not marijuana or even alcohol anymore that we're talking about. Crack, fentanyl, heroin, meth. But yeah, it's basically non-enforcement of laws against public camping, non-enforcement of laws against public defecation. We don't really have a functioning psychiatric and addiction care system. The counties are overwhelmed by this problem and they don't deal with it efficiently. So there's both gaps and redundancies in the system. All carrots, no stick. no consequences for illegal behavior and self-destructive behavior.
We know that Dr. Margot Kushel at UCSF said what homelessness is not about is substance use and mental health problems.
What homelessness is not about is substance use and mental health problems.
There's been this idea that people are on the street because they can't afford the rent, and that they are not on the street because of addiction, or that they were to the extent which they suffer from addiction, it's after they ended up on the street. I mean, this is just that's just total misinformation. But the people that we see on the street, it's not explained by high rents. Like millions of people leave California or have left California over the last 2 decades to go to other states because they couldn't afford the rent. Nobody decides to go live in a tent in the most dangerous and dirty sidewalks in America because they can't afford the rent. You do that if you're addicted to hard drugs and you want to be in the middle of a hard drug scene.
So I want to ask about the California's Mental Health Services Act, which was passed in 2004, that basically levies 1% income tax on millionaires, right? It was originally designed with good intention to transform California's behavioral health system to better serve people with serious mental health issues.
Mental Health Services Act, the fundamental problem is that it's all voluntary, and a significant number of mentally ill people, untreated mentally ill people, don't believe that they're mentally ill. They don't think that they should be required to get the help they need. Often they're in a psychotic state. Same thing for addicts, except for the reverse. Often the people that are having in psychosis who are mentally ill are off their meds, and then the addicts are on their meds causing psychosis. But the state needs to have the power to compel treatment of people who break the law. I think that it's going to be very hard, and I wouldn't support it. I don't think we should criminalize either addiction or mental illness. I think it's sad, actually, that we probably can't figure out a way to do that. But I just think America in particular, we love our freedom so much. It's going to be very hard to compel that. So it means I think you have to wait until the person commits a crime. Now, that happens very frequently for people that are on the street. They're camping publicly, using drugs publicly, defecating publicly, nuisance violations, vagrancy laws, all sorts of ways in which they might break the law, and be brought before a judge, get a psychiatric evaluation, a professional psychiatric evaluation, and have the choice to get rehab or psychiatric care rather than go to jail or prison. So if you don't arrest people for breaking laws, the laws will be broken. So there's a famous expression, right, which is that you get more of what you tolerate. So if you're tolerating open drug scenes and these behavioral disorders, we're going to get more of them, and that's what's happening. Mm-hmm. And it's only happening because people refuse to enforce the laws. You know, if the major cities of San Francisco and Los Angeles just enforced the laws, that would have some benefit. Problem is, you'd end up with a lot of drug addicts and mentally ill people in jail and prison. It's not great. You know, a better would be to be in some sort of facility, you know, probably even unlocked facility in places, you know, where away from the drug scene, chance to do group therapy, individual therapy, learn cognitive behavioral therapy, have a Suboxone taper so you can detox, learn some skills, reconnect with family and friends who you've alienated because you've lied, cheated, and stolen from them so frequently over the course of your addiction. So I do think there's a better way, but yeah, if it doesn't happen, then it seems like they could just resort to a law enforcement method, which, you know, voters have mostly repudiated. They would like to see people get treatment. So yeah, if it doesn't happen at the statewide level, it could happen at the city level. I guess I worry that it'd be very hard to do because San Francisco is just a postage stamp of a city. It's so small that it's just inconceivable that you could fit all those people in San Francisco. And even Los Angeles, you know, which is much bigger, it's still hard to get stuff built, and so much faster and cheaper in the Central Valley, for example, and in places that are far away from the drug scene.
I mean, some people would just come back to that point you just made and say, hey, permanent supportive housing, we do provide the wraparound services, and then that will, you know, provide all the services you just described. So
right.
What about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's basically what we do now. I mean, the status quo is providing services voluntarily. So,
and they claim to have success.
Well, and they do to some extent. It's just that the people that refuse the services are also the people that are in the worst shape. I mean, this young woman I interviewed today looked like she was a minor. You know, I asked if she would talk to me. She barely could talk. She was so out of it. And if you were to be like, hey, would you like to come in and get some services? She's going to be like, no. I've talked to several other guys I talked to, and they were like, no. Well, then you need to go the next step and say, you can't stay here. You can't sleep on the sidewalk. It's a hazard. It's a threat to public health.
Mhm.
And no, you can't just move somewhere else in the city. There has to be you have to take responsibility. That means getting yourself indoors. So, I mean, in some ways, it's very simple. I mean, either we're going to enforce the laws that make city life possible, which is also the right way to get people into the care and treatment that they need, or you're not, and things are just going to get worse and worse. But there is no kind of workaround to the need to actually enforce laws against public camping, public defecation, and public drug use. You know, for me, that's the obvious nexus point. Is you kind of go, what does it consist of? You know, three things: shelter first, treatment first, housing earned, enforcing the laws, and universal psychiatric care. I think we need all three of them.
That's interesting what you just said, housing is earned. Some people would say housing is a basic human right, and that they even cite some UN reports say like housing is a human right. So how would you respond to that?
I think shelter is a human right. That's what the United Nations actually is saying, by the way. I mean,
I see.
The United Nations is not, I mean, the intention of that statement when they wrote that was not having a apartment unit in San Francisco is your human right. It was not that at all. It just said, yeah, housing, shelter. I mean, I agree. You shouldn't leave people to sleep on the street. We can't. It's just not, it's not safe. It's not safe for them. It's not safe for anybody else. But the idea that you need to give people their own house, I don't think that's supported. I don't think that's ethically accurate. Now, there's then people, and it doesn't all have to be shelter. I mean, congregate shelters can be uniquely unpleasant places. So my aunt had schizophrenia. She did really well. She lived in a group home in Denver called residential care. I think there was like 5 other people. They each had their own bedroom, which many people want. I think they shared a bathroom. I think they shared a kitchen, a dining area. And she did great. She had very good outcomes. And that's totally within reach.
City leaders, for example, in San Francisco, how can they ignore problems as they're happening outside their city hall windows?
Well, it's not really ignoring. It's sort of worse than that. It's sort of making the problem worse. The mayor of San Francisco, we thought that she was moving in the right direction. In mid-December, she announced a crackdown on open-air drug dealing and drug use. Instead, all she's done is created a supervised city-funded drug addiction and consumption site in a public plaza, which is unauthorized and illegal, totally experimental. It's a medical experiment. That's the only way to understand it. It's not ethical in my view. I don't think that people can provide their consent because of their their late stage addiction, substance use disorder, and mental illness. So it's sort of worse than that. And the people that are really in charge of the institutions, which are tasked with taking care of that population, are the ones creating the problem. It's really Department of Mental Health is captured by fairly radical, extreme people with extreme views. They claim to be doing what Europe did, but they're not. Europe does not allow public camping, public drug use, public defecation, at least not at the extent to which California or San Francisco do. So I think it's not that they're ignoring it, it's that they're actively making it worse. I do think that they are now, I think it's so out of control, I think they don't know what to do. And so every time they try to respond to it, they end up making the problem worse because they can't overcome this ideology of victimhood, which would be required in order to hold people accountable for their behavior.
How do average San Franciscans think about this whole issue? Do they believe the government is doing the right thing?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think it's fair to say that people of San Francisco are divided. They did elect an extremely radical left district attorney who has stopped enforcing many laws. They've elected a board of supervisors that's very far left. On the other hand, now we see a recall election coming up for the board, the school board, and another recall election for the district attorney. I think both will pass, so you do have some backlash, but it's a very liberal people, and it's a very compassionate people, and there's obviously a lot of good about that. You know, there's a kind of culture on the web. There's sort of both a kind of political view, which is that this issue of victim ideology, but also that the system itself is corrupt, that our capitalist democratic system is evil or immoral or just has to be replaced by something different. And then there's more of a cultural thing, which is kind of like, it's kind of hippie, laid back surfer, you know, don't get so uptight. And the idea is that, you know, you shouldn't worry that much about these things, let people sleep outside.
Even the middle class or upper middle class or the ultra rich, the really rich people, they have to go to opera. They have to walk in certain neighborhood. They cannot just stay in their bubbles all day, right?
Right.
So what are they thinking now?
Yeah. And by the way, the opera in San Francisco is right near where the open drug scenes are. So it's not a wrong comparison. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think that things are changing very rapidly. I can just see it in my social media. I can see the more traffic. I can see it in the things that people say, they say in the comments. So I think things are definitely changing on the one hand. On the other hand, this ideology is very powerful because, you know, it's like the ideas become a kind of religion, and that means that it's a way to give your life meaning. I mean, if you don't believe in God, you know, so if you're a Christian, you think that ultimately you'll be judged by God and that that's your highest moral value. There's a moral order that's judging you, or there's some pressure on you to conform. Well, if you don't have that, you know, I find that people end up creating their own moral order. And that moral order is that there are victims and oppressors, and to victims, everything and nothing should be required. And they just are very, very, they police it like really aggressively.
So for San Francisco and LA, we know street homelessness has really gotten out of control, right? Do you still have an optimistic view about the future, the near future? Maybe there are some opportunities people can take to turn things around?
And there's obviously people leaving. There's a lot of, there's a lot of successful businesses that are leaving, going to places like Miami. You know, we saw Joe Rogan leave, obviously, major media, maybe the biggest media figure in the United States right now. We've seen businesses leave. Elon Musk left. So a lot of people are leaving. A lot of people are staying. You know, the people that have kids in school, people that just love California, think it's irreplaceable. No one's coming to rescue us. We Californians have to save ourselves. I think it's a huge challenge. I mean, this is a really big problem, and you're mixing together very different groups of people. You've got people that are, you know, 75-year-old schizophrenics, and you got 25-year-old fentanyl addicts. The good news is that when we confront difficult challenges, it makes us better. It requires something of us. It requires our best selves. So I think we should look to this as a real challenge to evolve our country. I mean, the United States, in some ways, we are a very young country, and we're kind of immature there's something childlike. Keep waiting for somebody else to take responsibility. We don't know why we have to take responsibility. Can't somebody else do this? And we're just completely obsessed with freedom, which, along with compassion, is a very important thing. We should have compassion. We should have freedom. But neither of them are worth anything and are actually quite destructive if not balanced by responsibility. So I close San Francisco by pointing out that a great Austrian psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl pointed out that, you know, we have a Statue of Liberty on the East Coast. We need a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast. You know, by taking responsibility, we transcend ourselves. You know, if we're taking responsibility for this problem, we transcend ourselves, we become something else. We become better people. So I think that here in this issue, which obviously you've identified something you care about, and I and many others realize we care about, we know that our civilization is not possible as long as the drug, crime, and homeless crisis continues to spiral out of control. And for that reason, we need to work together and take responsibility. I think it will make us better people. I don't know how long it will take for that to happen, but I think we're in a moment of real change. I think people are really fed up and ready for some for some action now.
That. Thank you so much,
Sure.
Michael, for speaking with me today. We really appreciate your support, but please stay well and healthy.
Thank you so much. I look forward to the results.